بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم افتح لنا حكمتك وانشر علينا رحمتك وزدنا علما يا كريم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. We are doing our ninth lesson on our commentary of Risalat al-Jami'ah. And in our ninth lesson today we'll be covering the first half of the chapter that deals with Hajj and Umrah. Hajj, the author rahimahullah says, وَأَمَّا الْحَجُّ فَهُوَ خَامِسُ أَرْكَانِ الْإِسْلَامِ وَهُوَ فَرْضٌ عَلَى كُلِّ مُسْلِمٍ مُكَلَّفٍ حُرٍّ وَكَذَا الْعُمْرَةُ فِي الْعُمْرِ مَرَّةٍ. So he's saying that Hajj is the fifth rukn, or the fifth integral of Islam, and you'll remember it from the hadith that we did at the beginning of this course, بُنِيَ الْإِسْلَامُ عَلَى خَمْسٍ. So this is the last one, or that Islam is built upon 5 foundations. So this is the fifth rukn or integral that is mentioned. Okay, Hajj linguistically, it means to intend or to head into a specific direction, but legally here it means we're talking about intending a specific set, intending or visiting the sacred house to fulfill a specific set of rites or rituals. Okay, he says it's خامس أركان الإسلام, and it's known by necessity. So it's known, what we call, it's known by ضرورة, necessity. So denying it is disbelief. Denying it is grounds for disbelief. He says وَهُوَ فَرْضٌ عَلَى كُلِّ مُسْلِمٍ. So it's a fard ayn. It's a fard ayn. And we said that there's a difference between a fard ayn, which is an individual obligation, and a fard kifaya, which is a communal obligation. So Hajj is a specific obligation on every individual that's able to do it. And he lists a number of conditions for it. He says, عَلَى كُلِّ مُسْلِمٍ مُكَلَّفٍ حُرٍّ. So for every person that's a Muslim, obviously, so it's not obligatory upon a disbeliever. Mukallaf is a person that's legally responsible. And we gave a definition of what's legally responsible. A person who's legally responsible is two things. One, mature, and the second has their mental faculties. So we said that it's balighun aqilun. That's mukallaf. Baligh is a person who is mature, and aqil is a person who has the command of their mental faculties. So anybody that doesn't fit that description doesn't have to do Hajj. So it's not obligatory upon a person who isn't baligh. So a person who's a child doesn't have to do Hajj, and a person who is doesn't have command of their mental faculties doesn't have to do Hajj. But if either of them did it, then it's permissible for them to do it, and they would be rewarded for doing it. But it's not obligatory. Okay, the author says hurrin, so a person that's free, so it's not obligatory upon a slave. And the last condition that I mentioned is that a person has to be able to do it. A person has to be able to do it, and we'll talk in a bit of detail about what this ability means. The Quran says, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَلِلَّهِ عَلَى النَّاسِ حِجُّ الْبَيْتِ مَنِ اسْتَطَاعَ إِلَيْهِ سَبِيلًا. That it's God's right that people who are able to do so visit or perform the Hajj to the Kaaba. Okay, the author says, he says, وَكَذَا الْعُمْرَةُ فِي الْعُمْرِ مَرَّةٍ. So he says, as well as Umrah is obligatory in a person's lifetime once. So فِي الْعُمْرِ مَرَّةٍ, like in a person's lifetime once, that relates to both Hajj and Umrah. So Hajj is obligatory once in a lifetime, and Umrah is also obligatory once in a lifetime. So there's an usuli question: is it obligatory right away, or is it obligatory at an unspecified time in the future? So if a person has the money or the means, and they're able to go to Hajj, for example, this year, and they haven't performed it before, is it obligatory upon a person to do it this year or at an unspecified time in the future? It's an unspecified time in the future, so it's not obligatory this year. A person can do it at any time in the future. But if they're able to do so and they don't do it, and then they die at some point before having performed it, then they would die in a state of sin. Okay, because they had been able to perform it, but they didn't. but they didn't. And we'll talk about, when we talk about ability, we'll talk about a person making up the Hajj for them because it was obligatory. Um, he says, as well as the Umrah. So Umrah is a lesser pilgrimage. So Hajj is the major pilgrimage. Umrah is a lesser pilgrimage, and it just means to visit. But here, of course, legally, we're talking about visiting the Kaaba to fulfill specific rites. Okay, and he says that it's obligatory to perform them both once in a lifetime. So you don't have to perform them both at the same time. Most people that are going from, for example, outside of Saudi Arabia, they'll do it together. So they'll go there, and their program tends to be something like they'll perform Umrah first, and then they'll perform Hajj, and then they'll go back. So they'll cover both bases, and that's doing it in that order like that is what we call tamattu'. Like it's a type of order for Hajj, and I'll tell you about the different orders for Hajj in a bit. But my point here is that they don't have to be done together. So a person can go just specifically for Umrah without ever having performed Hajj. So sometimes people ask that. They say, well, I haven't gone for Hajj, can I go for Umrah? Yeah, the answer is yes. The Quran says, وَأَتِمُّ الْحَجَّ وَالْعُمْرَةَ لِلَّهِ. So the school that complete Hajj and Umrah for Allah's sake or for God's sake. So the school uses that to hold that both of them are obligatory, not just a specific one, or not at the same time. Okay, so a person can go and do Hajj and not do Umrah, and they can go and do an Umrah and not do Hajj, like that. Okay, and like Hajj, Umrah isn't obligatory immediately. Okay, the author says, may Allah be pleased with him, he says, بِشَرْطِ الْإِسْتِطَاعَةِ بِشَرْطِ الْإِسْتِطَاعَةِ, with the condition of ability. So we're going to talk about what ability here means. وَهِيَ أَن يَمْلِكَ مَا يَحْتَاجُ إِلَيْهِ فِي سَفَرِهِ إِلَى الْحَجِّ ذَهَابًا وَإِيَابًا. So istita'a, or ability here, is for a person to possess what they would need during their travel, فِي سَفَرِهِ إِلَى الْحَجِّ, in their travel towards, on the way to Hajj, ذَهَابًا وَإِيَابًا, that's going and coming back. Okay, وَنَفَقَةَ مَنْ تَلْزَمُهُ نَفَقَتُهُ إِلَى رُجُوعِهِ. So a person should also have or be in possession of what they would need to sustain or to support the people that they have to support during that period, like going and their stay there and coming back. Okay, so generally the condition of ability is obviously a pretty important condition, because the Quran says وَلِلَّهِ عَلَى النَّاسِ حِجُّ الْبَيْتِ مَنِ اسْتَطَاعَ إِلَيْهِ سَبِيلًا. So although it's obligatory with that specific condition, that a person be able to. And it doesn't define the condition, but jurists have enumerated a number of conditions or a number of ways that we can ascertain whether a person has the actual ability to do so. So generally speaking, there's two types of ability. One is a person himself, or one is through a person himself, and that's the kind of thing that the author describes in the text here. And there's also ability through another person. Like if a person is totally unable to do it, he can get another person to do it for him. So that's a different type of ability. So we'll talk about both. The first one, ability by oneself. There are a number of conditions that we find in classical works of fiqh, a number of which are still applicable today. The first one is that a person have possession of their travel necessities. So that's the one that the author mentions when he says وَهِيَ أَن يَمْلِكَ مَا يَحْتَاجُ إِلَيْهِ فِي سَفَرِهِ إِلَى الْحَجِّ ذَهَابًا وَإِيَابًا, that a person have what they need during their travel. So their travel necessities, like anything that they'll need to go and come back, and also to sustain themselves while they're there. So money for food, clothes, medicine, all of those things would be covered. So if a person is going for Hajj from Toronto, for example, and they have enough for a plane ticket, but they don't have enough to cover their entire stay while they're there, the general things that a person would need, then we wouldn't say Hajj is obligatory upon that person. Okay, so if they're just a little bit short, Hajj still wouldn't be obligatory upon that person. They would need enough money to cover all of the things that they would need. Okay, so even if they have enough to go but not to come back, then we still wouldn't say that it's obligatory. Some of the fiqh books actually say that if a person, even if a person doesn't have any family and doesn't have any friends in his hometown, and he has enough to go but doesn't have enough to come back, does he have to go? Because he's not missing anything if he doesn't come back. They say no. A person doesn't have to. It still isn't obligatory. Okay, so he has to have enough to go to come back, and he has to have a. There has to be present a suitable means for him to get there. So for going from Toronto, for example, a person, there'd have to be airplane flights that go. If you're going from Riyadh, for example, then you would just need, there have to be, for example, cars, so that you can get to Mecca. Okay, so both of these things, the presence of an appropriate means of transportation, and also the things that a person would need to get there and to stay there and to come back, all of those things have to be superfluous to what the author here mentions. وَنَفَقَةُ مَنْ تَلْزَمُهُ نَفَقَتُهُ إِلَى رُجُوعِهِ. So that would be, he has to have more than what he would need to sustain, for example, his family while he's going. So if a person saves up some money and they have enough to go and to sustain themselves while they're there and to come back, but they don't have enough to cover their family's needs while they're gone, then it's not permissible for them to go. They can't just decide, well, I'm going to go for Hajj because it's obligatory, but they're not supporting their family. That's not. It's not just that it's not obligatory. It's not permissible. So they have to. A person would have to leave enough for the people that he would normally support while he's gone. So, for example, his wife and his children, if they're unable to support themselves, and his parents, for example, if they're unable to support themselves. So you'd have to leave enough for them to. So in these days, a person might go for 2 weeks. So a person would have to leave that amount. Okay, if they're going for longer, obviously, then for a longer amount. Another condition that is found in classical works of fiqh is that the way has to be safe and secure. So this might have been more of a concern in historically, because, for example, people would be traveling over land. So historically, for example, there was a time when people in the eastern region of Saudi Arabia couldn't travel to the Hijaz region of Saudi Arabia for Hajj because of bandits, more or less. Bandits, more or less, in the area of what we now consider Riyadh. So if that were the case, then it wouldn't be obligatory for them to perform Hajj. So even if they had the money and they had the means, they have enough for their family, it still wouldn't be obligatory. And you can imagine if people are going by boat and there are like pirates or something. I don't know if there are still pirates, but if there were, then it wouldn't be obligatory for someone to go. Okay, and the same goes for air travel. If for some reason it's not safe, then we wouldn't say a person is it's obligatory. So you can even imagine it. For example, if a person is traveling from Toronto and they stop over, for example, in Turkey, on their way to Mecca, and then there's a storm or something like that, and the planes can't take off, then we wouldn't say, well, Hajj was obligatory upon you this year, you had to do it. It would, like, the obligation would drop. Okay. Another condition that they mention is that a person has to be able to get there on time. So imagine you didn't have everything, and all of a sudden, like, things fall into place for you. Like, you get your visa, you get your plane ticket, or you suddenly come into wealth, and you're able to do it, but there's not enough time for you to get there, like at a normal speed. So imagine you're in Riyadh, and it normally takes about 10 hours driving there, and you get the money, and everything falls into place for you. You get your tashira, or you get your visa to go, and there's only 5 hours left. So you'd have to travel at 180 kilometers per hour just to make it to Mecca. So we would say, well, no, it's not obligatory upon you that year. Okay. Another condition that they mention, it relates specifically to women. You have to have a suitable travel companion for a woman. So it can be her husband, or it can be a relative that she can travel with, or it can be a group of trustworthy women that she can travel with. If she can't find that, then Hajj also wouldn't be obligatory. So if she wants to perform Hajj and she has everything that she would need, but her husband doesn't want to go with her, then it wouldn't be obligatory upon her to perform Hajj. Okay, and that's with respect to obligation. It's permissible for her to travel for an obligatory Hajj, even if it's alone, if she's reasonably sure that the way is safe. Okay, so if the way is safe, then it's permissible for her to travel alone for an obligatory Hajj. Okay, so there are some other conditions that they mention. One is the presence of supplies on the way. So no one travels with everything that they need, but they tend to buy things along the way. So for example, I performed Hajj from Riyadh. So if I'm leaving from Riyadh and there are no gas stations on the way, for example, or there are gas stations but they're out of gas, for example, and you know that for some obscure reason, then it wouldn't be obligatory for you to perform Hajj, because you can make it halfway and then you get stuck, or you'll get stuck on the road. So those are some of the things that they mention, and they give you an idea of what jur is considered to be ability. So you can use that as a starting point to ascertain whether or not you are able to perform Hajj. Okay, that's ability when it comes to when it's related to a person himself. There's also what they call ability through another person. So that's if that could be if a person, they're just simply not able to perform Hajj, like they're not able to move. So for example, if they're bedridden, or if they're just not physically well, so they're unable to perform the rites of Hajj, or to get there themselves, they can get someone else to do it for them. Okay, so that's considered ability through another person. Or for example, if a person died and they were able to do Hajj but they didn't do it, so that also is another case of having someone else do it. So if a person can't do it, like they're unable to move, or to get there. One of the things that they mention for ability, for example, is a person has all the things that they would normally need, but they can't, for example, sit on an animal that would take them. They can't do it because usually either because the person is too fat, or they're overweight, or maybe the person's too skinny. So it'd really be difficult. They envisioned it as like a person riding on a camel, or riding on a horse, or something like that. So, but the same thing applies for any other means of travel. So there might be some people that are unable to travel like in an airplane, or to sit 14 hours from Toronto to Jeddah, for example. So that kind of person, you would say it's not obligatory for them to perform Hajj, but they'd have to get someone else to do it. So even though they themselves are not able to do it, their ability is accomplished through another person. So they have to get someone else to do it. And there's two ways to do it. One is to pay a person to do it, to pay them a reasonable salary that a person would normally get to perform that kind of thing. So it's obligatory to do that. So a person can't just say, well, I'm not able to do Hajj, so the obligation falls. Like they have to pay someone to do it if they can't find someone who'll do it for free. Yeah. Okay, so they can do that, or they must do that, and get someone to do it with a salary. Or they can, there might be someone that wants to do it for free. So if there is someone that wants to do it for free, then all well and done. But that person has to have done their obligatory Hajj. So let's say I haven't done my Hajj and I'm not able to do it, and then my brother says, I'll do the Hajj for you. If he hasn't done the Hajj already, then he has to do his obligatory Hajj first. He can't say, I'm going to do a Hajj for someone else. Okay? If a person dies, so like we said, a person, if they died and they were able to do it, but they didn't, for whatever reason, and then they passed away, someone has to be found who will perform the Hajj for that person immediately. Okay, it becomes like an immediate obligation. So they'd have to, the same thing, they would have to pay someone to do it, and the money for that would be taken from a person's estate. Okay, the person who passed away, from their estate, it would, the salary for that person would be taken from their estate. And if they don't leave behind anything that covers the cost, then it's recommended that one of the inheritors do it. And obviously it's not obligatory. Yeah, I mean, anyone actually can do it. It's recommended that an inheritor do it, but anybody can do it on behalf of that person. Um, and that obviously is a recommended action because it would remove that obligation from the person that passed away. Okay, but that's the reason why, because it's obligatory, and because a person can be in that situation where nobody does the Hajj for them, that's the reason why people should ensure that they do the Hajj as soon as they can. Like, even though it's not an immediate obligation, no one knows when they're going to pass away, so they should try to do it before other things occupy them. So that's the important condition, ability. So the author moves now to talk about the legal aspects of Hajj. He says, وَأَعْمَالُ الْحَجِّ ثَلَاثَةُ أَشْيَاء أَرْكَانٌ وَوَاجِبَاتٌ وَسُنَنٌ. Okay, the author, may Allah be pleased with him, says that the actions of Hajj are, well, there are three types. There are arkan, there are integrals, and wajibat and sunan. So you'll remember that we said that in all of the chapters of fiqh or law, in the Shafi'i school at least, a rukn, an integral, and a wajib mean the same thing. They're used synonymously. But we said that we'll differentiate between the two when we come to Hajj. So here we are at Hajj, and we are differentiating. Rukns, a Hajj has to have it. If you don't have the integral, it's like the normal integrals that we were talking about. If your Hajj doesn't have it, your Hajj is incomplete and not valid. Okay? And we'll enumerate them. A wajib is not like a rukn. Your Hajj should have it, and if you miss it, then you have to pay a type of expiation. Okay? But your Hajj would still remain valid even if you don't do it. Okay? For the most part, the expiation would be to sacrifice a sheep and to donate it to poor people. A sheep that is over a year, that is over a year old. But there are different types of expiation which we'll get to. And the last one is sunan. And the only legal thing that obviously they're recommended actions, but if a person doesn't do it, then there is no expiation, and their Hajj would still be valid. Okay, Hajj is a little bit difficult to wrap your head around because most people haven't done it. So when we talk about like Salah, for example, it's really easy to talk about arkan and wajibat and that kind of thing because everybody prays already 5 times a day. So it's really easy to talk about the sajda and the i'tidal and that kind of thing, and everybody gets it right away for the most of the issues. But for Hajj, because people haven't done it, the days and that kind of thing get a bit confusing. So like at a very basic level, if you just keep in mind that we're talking about specific days and things that you have to do in specific days. So there are different types of order, which we'll talk about, but at a sort of basic level, all of the actions of Hajj would happen for the most part in Dhul Hijjah, which is the last month of the Islamic calendar. And it would start with the 9th of Dhul Hijjah, which is the day of Arafah. Okay, that's the 9th of Dhul Hijjah. And the day after that is the 10th of Dhul Hijjah, and it's the day of Eid. Okay, and it's also called Yawm al-Nahr. Yawm al-Nahr, the day of sacrifice, because that's when people sacrifice. So that's the 10th of Dhul Hijjah. Okay, and the night of that we would call it Laylatul Nahr, the night before it. Okay, so that's the 9th of Dhul Hijjah, Arafah, and the 10th of Dhul Hijjah is the day of Eid, or Yawm al-Nahr. And after that are 3 days, which we call 3 days of Tashriq. Okay, so the first day of Tashriq is the day after Eid, and then the second and the third. Okay, so you can stay for 2 days of Tashriq or 3 days of Tashriq. So your Hajj can either be 4 or 5 days. Okay, so the different actions that we'll be talking about starting now from the arkan of Hajj, they'll all be accomplished during that period. So maybe you can chart it out when you're listening, when we talk about like when you do certain things, and in that way you'll have a sort of an order of how things actually play out in Hajj. So the author isn't going to do in this work. He's not doing a step by step. So first you do this and then you do that. Other works like Umdat Salik, for example, are like that. It starts like it mixes all of the sunan and the wajibat and the arkan. So it starts with like first you do this and then you do that and then you go there. But not this work. Here he just breaks it down into what's a rukn and what's a wajib and that kind of thing. So you have to sort of piece it together, which if you haven't done Hajj, it's confusing. Actually, because it's only once a year, even if you've done Hajj, it's confusing. So even people like students of knowledge and Shaykh that I know review the chapters of Hajj before they go on Hajj because it's not fresh. Okay, so the author says فَالْأَرْكَانُ خَمْسَةٌ, that there are 5 rukns, there are 5 integrals. The first one is al-ihramu. The first one is ihram, and ihram here doesn't mean wearing the ihram. So people call the ihram, people call the thing that they wear the ihram, but when we're talking about the rukn of ihram, it's something different. It's وَهُوَ نِيَّةُ الدُّخُولِ فِي الْحَجِّ أَوْ الْعُمْرَةِ. So the ihram is actually the intention to enter into Hajj or for Umrah. Okay, so the intention, like all the other chapters, it has to be in the heart. But saying it aloud is a sunnah. And that's what the author says, وَيُسْتَحَبُّ أَن يَقُولَ مَعَ ذَلِكَ نَوَيْتُ الْحَجَّ أَوْ الْعُمْرَةَ وَأَحْرَمْتُ بِهِ لِلَّهِ تَعَالَى. That it's recommended to say along with the intention, well, to verbalize the intention. Okay, so here it will be nawaitul hajj, that I intend the Hajj or Umrah. Wa ahramtu bihi, that I enter into state of ihram. Lillahi ta'ala, for the sake of God, or for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, and that's the type of intention that you would make for a specific type of Hajj, which is called ifrad. Okay, and I'll tell you about that in a second. He says, وَيُسْتَحَبْ, that it's recommended to say that. Obviously, it's not obligatory then. And a person can just, if they had the intention in their mind, nawaitul hajj, that would be sufficient. Like I'm intending Hajj. And if they were to verbalize that alone, like I'm intending Hajj, that would also be sufficient. But he adds some extra things in. He says, وَأَحْرَمْتُ بِهِ, and that I'm entering into state of ihram, and that's just for emphasis. It means the same thing. And he adds in lillahi ta'ala, that for Allah the Most High. And again, that's not obligatory, but it's to remind oneself to be sincere in the actions of Hajj, because Hajj is one of those actions that there's a lot of opportunity for people to see you doing things. So everybody knows that you're going for Hajj, like your family and friends. And when you go there, like today, there's about 3 million people that are seeing you do the Hajj, and so everybody around you can see you doing the things for Hajj. So it's very easy for us to forget that we're doing this for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's one of the reasons why the author mentions it here, that it's to remind oneself that they're doing it as an obligation to fulfill. They're fulfilling an obligation for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they're not doing it for other people to see. Yeah. So there's 3 ways of performing the Hajj that we said. The first one is it's a bit difficult to visualize. There are 3 types. The first is al-ifrad, and the second is called tamattu', and the third one is called qiran. The first one is called ifrad, the second one is tamattu', and the third one is qiran. So most people, when they go, they're doing tamattu'. They're doing something that they're performing. The way that they're performing Hajj is called tamattu'. It's to start with the Umrah, and then it's to complete it, and then to do the Hajj, to enter into the state of ihram for Hajj. Okay, and most people that go for Hajj, when you hear them going for Hajj, they'll be doing that kind of system. The second one is called ifrad, and that's to enter into a state of ihram just for Hajj. So you're not intending to do Umrah and Hajj. It's recommended to do Umrah after in the same year. Okay, but when you're making the intention, it's just for Hajj. And that's actually the best one in the Shafi'i school, to do the Hajj, to intend the Hajj alone, and then to do the Umrah at a later point. And that's actually when I did the Hajj from Riyadh, we did that. That was the way that we did it. We did it as ifrad. Okay, and the third type is called qiran, and that's the intent that you're doing Hajj and Umrah at the same time. So you intend Hajj and Umrah at the same time, and then you perform just the actions of Hajj, but you sort of subsume the actions of Umrah into it. So it's kind of like, that's why it's called Qiran, because it's kind of like you join both of them together. Okay, so I mean, it's not necessary to know what the three different types are, but it's good to know in case you're going for Hajj, like your Hajj group might be doing a specific type, so you kind of, you know what you're doing. Okay, and both Tamattu' and Qiran in the Shafi'i school, there's an expiation to pay for them because you haven't gone to the miqat. So we'll talk about going to the miqat or or entering into a state of ihram from specific places. So because you've performed the Umrah first, and then you finished the Umrah, and then without going to the miqat, you've gone into a state of ihram to perform the Hajj, you have to pay an expiation for that, for either Tamattu' or Qiran. Okay, so the expiation would be a sheep, like we mentioned, and if they are unavailable, then you'd fast 3 days in Hajj and 7 days upon your return. Okay, and that would be the expiation for doing it like Tamattu', which I think is the most common way of doing it when groups are going from outside of Saudi Arabia. Like the Western world, I think that's how they tend to do them. Okay, now the last thing that the author mentions here, when it comes to ihram, he says, وَلَا يَصِحُ الْإِحْرَامُ بِالْحَجِّ إِلَّا فِي أَشْهُرِهِ, that you can't enter into a state of ihram for Hajj except in its specific months. So if you enter into a state of ihram for Hajj outside of these months, then it would be as if you made the intention for Umrah. So now is, let's say it's Muharram, for example. That's not a month of Hajj, and a person were to say Nawaitul Hajj, for example, and they were intend Hajj, like they would have to go perform an Umrah. Okay, so they would enter into a state of ihram, but it would be a state of ihram for Umrah. Okay, so the author says, وَهِيَ شَوَّالٌ وَذُو الْقَعْدَةِ وَعَشْرُ ذِي الْحِجَّةِ وَآخِرُهَا طُلُوعُ فَجْرِ لَيْلَةِ النَّحْرِ. So he mentions that the beginning time for Hajj is the beginning of Shawwal, and it ends with the Fajr of the day of Eid. So he calls it Laylat al-Nahr. So that's Fajr of the day of Eid. Okay, it's the day of sacrifice, and that, as we said, is the 10th of Dhul Hijjah. So any time up to that, up to Fajr, for example, a person can make the niyyah or the intention for Hajj. Okay, he says, وَبَاقِ الْأَرْكَانِ. Now he's going to talk about the rest of the arkan. He says, الْوُقُوفُ بِعَرَفَةٍ وَطَوَافُ الْإِفَاضَةِ وَالسَّعْيُ وَالْحَلْقُ أَوْ التَّقْصِيرُ. Okay, so the rest of the arkan are being present at Arafah. The Tawaf al-Ifada, that's a specific type of, it's the Tawaf for Hajj, and the Sa'i, that's going between or covering the distance between Safa and Marwa, and wal-halqu aw al-taqsir, which is shaving or trimming the hair. So let's talk quickly about the rest of the arkan. The first one, al-wuqufu bi-Arafah, is standing at Arafah or being present at Arafah. The Prophet ﷺ said, al-hajju Arafah, man ja'a laylata jam'in faqad adraka al-hajj. So Hajj, well, he equates Hajj with being present at Arafah, and so whoever is present for it has accomplished Hajj, so to speak. So the obligatory aspect is that a person would be in a state of ihram and they're present in the grounds of Arafat, okay, for a moment. And the time for Arafah is from the time of Dhuhr, that's the time of Zawal, when the sun reaches the midpoint or the zenith in the sky on the 9th of Dhul Hijjah. Okay, that's the first. So if you're charting this, you can put that in. So from the time of Zawal, on the 9th of Dhul Hijjah, that's when the time for Arafah starts. That's the first rukn. And it lasts, like we said, until Fajr of the day of Eid. Okay. So we said that the night, in the Islamic calendar, the night always precedes the day, except for Arafah. Arafah is an example of the night actually coming after. So the time for Arafah starts from the time of Dhuhr and extends up until the time of Fajr of the next day of Eid. So a person could be present in Arafah for a moment. That's all it really, that would accomplish the obligatory aspect. So they don't have to spend like a lot of time there. They just have to be present for a moment. So even if they get there just before Fajr, on the day of Eid, you'd say that that person was present for Arafah. Okay, and you might see pictures of people being on the mountain, on Jabal al-Rahmah, but that's not a condition. So a lot of people try to go on the mountain itself, but there's no benefit to being on it. So Imam an-Nawawi says, for example, that there's no benefit to being on it. There's nothing recorded that mentions any benefit to being on the actual mountain. So the obligatory thing is just to be in the grounds, and the grounds is actually huge. The grounds of Arafat is huge. It's not just around that mountain. Okay, so you just have to be in a state of ihram in the grounds for a moment, and to be sane. Okay? And if you fulfill that, then you would have accomplished that rukn. Okay, you could even be sleeping. Okay, you just have to be there. Okay, but if you miss Arafat, you miss Hajj. Okay, so if you're trying to get there and for some reason you miss it, you will have missed Hajj. So you can get out of that state by because you're in ihram, you'd get out of that state by performing the actions of Umrah. So you do the tawaf and you do the sa'i, and then you'd either shave or trim your hair, and you'd get out of your state of ihram. But you'd have to make up the Hajj, and you'd have to pay an expiation, which is to sacrifice a sheep. Okay. So that's the first integral, being present at Arafah. The second one that he mentions is tawaf al-ifadah. So there's different types of tawaf. Tawaf is going around the Kaaba 7 times. Okay, that's what tawaf is, and it's obligatory. The Quran says وَلْيَطَّوَّفُوا بِالْبَيْتِ الْعَتِيقِ, that they perform tawaf around the ancient house. So that's an integral aspect of the Hajj. Okay, but like I said, there are different types of tawaf. One is called the tawaf al-qudum. Okay, that's when a person enters Mecca, and that's a sunnah. That's not the Hajj. That's not the tawaf for Hajj, and it's not the one we're talking about here. Here, the tawaf al-ifadah is the Hajj tawaf. There's also a tawaf called when you're leaving Mecca, and that one's wajib, but that again is not the one we're talking about here. Okay, this is the tawaf for Hajj, and the time for it begins from the middle of the night of Eid. So the middle of the night of Laylat al-Nahr. Okay, so we said that the time for Arafah, which is the first rukn, is from the time of Dhuhr on the 9th, and it extends up until the time of Fajr on the 10th. Okay, and this tawaf al-ifadah, or the tawaf for Hajj, starts before the time for Arafah even finishes, from the middle of that night, the 10th, the night of the 10th. Okay, so you can, for example, you could go to Arafah for a bit, and go and perform that the tawaf al-ifadah from the second half of the night. Okay, so you can get all of that done even before Fajr on the day of Eid. Okay, and we'll talk about the conditions for tawaf later. Now we're just talking about it as a rukn. Okay, the third one that he mentions is was-sa'yu, and sa'yu is covering the distance between Safa and Marwa. Okay, so that's the really important thing. And Safa and Marwa are two hills that are that are close to the Kaaba, and right now they're actually enclosed in a building. So it's fully enclosed in a building. You can still see Safa and you can still see Marwa, but they're both enclosed and there are different levels. So you just have to cover the distance between them. Okay, so a person who's in ihram, they would do that sa'i, they would cover that distance from Safa to Marwa and back 7 times. They can do it after the Tawaf al-Qudum or after the Tawaf al-Ifadah. Okay, and we'll talk about the conditions of the sa'i, but now we're just mentioning that it's a rukn. Okay, and the last thing that he mentions is halq or taqsir. So that's shaving or trimming, and that's an integral of Hajj. So the minimalist way of doing it is just to take out three hairs. So if you pull out 3 hairs from your head, that would be enough to fall under the rubric of halq or taqsir, or to cut out like a piece from 3 different hairs. Okay, so you can use any method of removal, but the best thing for men is to shave their head, and the best thing for women is to trim their hair. Okay, that's it for Arkan al-Hajj. The last thing that the author doesn't mention is order. Okay, so there are, it's not like Umrah, there are different orders that you have to do, or that you can follow. The obligatory thing is that ihram obviously has to come before everything else. So the niyyah, the intention for going into Hajj, it has to come before everything else. So you can't go to Arafah first and then have the intention for Hajj. Okay, so that's the big one. Arafah has to come before Tawaf, the Tawaf al-Ifadah, and shaving your head. Okay, Arafah has to come before Tawaf and shaving your head. So you can't do either of those before that. But you can do sa'i before Arafah. Okay, so you can do sa'i before Arafah if you do a Tawaf. A sa'i has to come after a Tawaf. So if you do a Tawaf before Arafah, like a Tawaf al-Qudum, then you could do a sa'i. Okay, if you didn't, then you have to do it after Arafah, after the actual Tawaf for Hajj. Okay, and there's no order between shaving your head and Tawaf. So you can shave your head, for example, and then go do the Tawaf for Hajj, and then do the sa'i after it. Okay, but the recommended order for one of the wajibat of Hajj that we'll mention, or the obligatory aspects, is throwing the pebbles, or rami. So the recommended order would be to do the rami, the throwing of the pebbles, and we'll describe it later, and then to do the shaving of the head, and then to do the tawaf. Okay, and the time for all of those things is from the middle of the night of Eid, so the 10th. Okay, so again, I know this might be confusing. So the 9th is the day of Arafah, and its time starts from the middle of the day. The waqt is the time of Zawal, and it extends up until Fajr. But from the middle of the same night, you can go do the pelting, which we'll describe later, or you can shave your head, or you can do tawaf. Okay, you can do any of those things. Okay, so you're in a state of ihram, and there are two tahalluls. A tahallul means like you're coming out of a state of ihram. So there's actually 2 tahalluls, and the first one you'd accomplish the first one by doing 2 of 3 things. So there are 3 things that you have to do. You have to do rami, which is the pelting, and the second is the tawaf, and the third one is the halq, or shaving your hair. So if you do any of those 2 things, you'd like partially come out of your state of ihram. And when you've partially come out of your state of ihram, you can do any of the things that were previously impermissible to do. And we'll talk about the things that were impermissible to do. But you can do any of those things, except for things that are related to the opposite gender. So, for example, getting married, or engaging in intercourse or foreplay, all of those things are impermissible while in a state of ihram. So none of those things would be permissible after the first tahallul. But when you do the third thing of either rami or tawaf or halq, when you do the third thing, then you would exit your state of ihram, and you could do anything that was impermissible to do. Okay, so those are the arkan. So again, we said the arkan, they're being at Arafah, the tawaf al-ifadah, the Hajj tawaf, and the sa'i, the going between Safa and Marwa, and then shaving your head or trimming your hair. so your Hajj, if you don't do any of those, if you don't do those things, that your Hajj would be invalid. Your Hajj would not be valid, or it would not be complete. Okay, the author says وأركان. He now goes into talk about the obligatory aspects of Umrah. So he says وأركان العمرة هي أركان الحج إلا الوقوف فليس منها. So Umrah compared to Hajj is really easy. You have the same integrals, you have the same arkan, and therefore, okay, they're the ihram, entering in the state of ihram to perform the Umrah, and you can do that at any time of the year. And the second one is tawaf, which is going around the Kaaba 7 times. And the third one is sa'i, which is going between Safa and Marwa. And the fourth is shaving or trimming your hair. Okay, and the fifth one is doing these things in order. So, unlike Hajj, you have to do all these things in order. You can't mix up the order. For example, like tawaf and halq. So you can't shave your hair before you perform the tawaf. Okay, the author then is now going to talk about the things that are obligatory, or obligatory aspects for tawaf and obligatory aspects for sa'i. Okay, so he'll talk about the things that are necessary to make a tawaf valid. So he says وَيَجِبُ لِلطَّوَافِ سَتْرُ الْعَوْرَةِ. So the first thing that he mentions is covering the awrah. So if something, this is like prayer. In our description of prayer, if something comes uncovered from a person's awrah, or the thing that the area that they have to cover, and they're able to cover it immediately, they would do it and continue with their tawaf. Okay, they wouldn't start over. They would just start from the place where it became uncovered. So it wouldn't render the tawaf invalid. They would just cover it. Okay, but if they don't do it and they continue doing their tawaf, that what they do after it becomes uncovered wouldn't be considered valid. Okay, he says وَالطَّهَارَةُ مِنَ الْحَدَثَيْنِ وَمِنَ النَّجَاسَةِ. So a person has to be in a state of purity. They have to be in a state of purity. So that covers both minor states of impurity and major states of impurity. Okay, because the tawaf is like prayer. Okay, so if a person breaks their wudu during tawaf, for example, they would make wudu and then they would continue from where they broke their wudu. They wouldn't start from the beginning. Okay, and also related to najasa is that the area, their body or clothes or the place that they're making tawaf also shouldn't be impure. So the same thing applies. So if something that isn't overlooked, like if their clothes become impure, for example, they would change it or remove the impurity and continue from where it became impure. They wouldn't start from the beginning. Okay, the author says وأن يكون سبع طوفات في المسجد. Yeah. So it has to be 7. Well, the technical term for it is like circumambulation. So it has to be 7. You have to make 7 tawafs for sure. So if you miss even a little bit, if you miss a step, then it wouldn't count. It has to be 7 for sure. If you're not sure, then you would do the same thing like we mentioned in salah. So if you're doing the tawaf and you're not sure, did I do 5 or 6, then you would just take the one that you're sure of, which is 5. Okay, and then you would continue and you would do 6, and you would do 7. And he says, let's see. He says, وَالْبَيْتُ عَنْ يَسَارِهِ وَهُوَ خَارِجٌ عَنْهُ. That the tawaf has to be in the Masjid al-Haram. So it doesn't matter how much the Masjid al-Haram is expanded, as long as it's in the masjid, and as long as the masjid itself is within the haram itself. So as long as the masjid is still within the haram, then you can do the tawaf anywhere in the masjid. So it can also be on different floors. So the Kaaba has its own airspace, so you can do tawaf on the roof as well. Okay, just not over the Kaaba. So he says the He says the house has to be on a person's left. Okay, so while you're moving forward, the Kaaba has to be on your left, and like right now, for example, it's not like you'll have a choice. Like you're not going to be able to go the other way because of there are so many people. But it still is a technical thing. You can't be going backwards the other way around. Okay, and the Kaaba has to be on your left side. So you can't be like facing the Kaaba with your body and then going around it like that. Yeah, you have to be facing it with your left shoulder. Okay, or if you're walking backwards or something like that, it wouldn't count. It has to be, you have to be moving forward, and the Kaaba has to be on your left hand side. Okay, and he says you have to be outside of the Kaaba. Okay, so the Kaaba right now is smaller than its original size. So for example, there's a hijr. So if you're going for tawaf and then you go inside, if you go through the hijr, then you wouldn't have done a tawaf around the Kaaba. So you have to go around the Kaaba. And the jurists are so nitpicky, so to speak, about this, that they say that you can't even, like, the Kaaba as it is right now, it's a cube, but the bottom of it comes out a little bit like that. I don't know the English name for it, but the bottom of it is a bit slanted like that. So they say that you can't even go close enough to the Kaaba that your hands are over it. So if you're making tawaf around the Kaaba and your hands are over it like this, like let's say you're touching the Kaaba and you're going around, you're dragging your hand, that would mean that your entire body isn't outside of the Kaaba. Like part of it is within the vicinity of the Kaaba. So then they say that your tawaf wouldn't count because you're not going around the Kaaba. Okay, the last thing is that you have to start from the black stone. Okay, so as opposed to some other schools, you don't have to start from the black stone. You could start from anywhere, but in the Shafi'i school, you have to start from the black stone, and that's easy to know because right now there's like a green light. There's a green light in the haram, so you can, if you just look at where the green light is, it lines up exactly with where the black stone is, and that's where your tawaf has to start. So if you start your tawaf from before it, and you're going around the Kaaba, that part wouldn't start, or wouldn't count, or if you were to start a little bit after it, that entire tawaf that you make wouldn't count. It starts from it starts and ends at the black stone. Okay, and the final thing is that your intention while you're doing tawaf has to be the tawaf. So you have to remember, it's not like each step that you take, you have to be like, I'm making tawaf, but if, for example, you start doing something that indicates that you've forgotten that you're doing tawaf, then you have to go back and continue from before. Your mind sort of got distracted. So let's say and this happens a lot. So let's say all of a sudden you think, well, I need to go get my shoes, for example, and you start walking to get your shoes. Even if you're still making tawaf, that period in which you thought, well, I need to go get my shoes, that wouldn't count. You'd have to go back and continue from where you were. There are other very common scenarios. Like for example, if you're making tawaf and the iqamah for prayer goes, or someone calls the iqamah for prayer, and people start lining up for prayer, you might be making tawaf and then all of a sudden think, well, okay, I need to go join the line for prayer. So you walk a bit to go join the line of prayer. So after the prayer, you'd have to go back to where you were before your intention kind of got confused, so to speak. Or if you see like someone you know, imagine you're making tawaf and then you see someone you know ahead of you. You might think, well, hey, I got to hurry up. Let me catch up to this guy that I know so I can say salam to him, and that kind of thing. So for that intermediate period where you're trying to catch up to that guy, since your mind isn't on tawaf, you'd have to go back. You'd have to go back to where you were. So that's with respect to tawaf. Okay. And now the author, may Allah be pleased with him, talks about sa'i. So, and this is the last thing we'll cover in this lesson. He says, وَيَجِبُ أَن يَكُونَ السَّعِي سَبْعًا وَبَعْدَ طَوَافٍ وَأَن يَبْدَأَ بِالصَّفَا وَيَخْتِمَ بِالْمَرْوَةِ. So, the obligatory aspects that he mentions are, first, that it has to be 7. He says sab'an. It has to be 7 times. And the same thing. So if you're unsure about while you're doing it, how many that you've done, you'd go with a lower number. Okay, you'd go with a lower number, and well, I guess you'd have to go down by one because, so you're going between Safa and Marwa. And from Safa to Marwa is one time. That's the first, so you have to do 7. So from Safa to Marwa is 1. From Marwa to Safa, like going back, is number 2. And so on and so forth. Okay, so you'd start from Safa and your 7th one would be Marwa. So if in one of them you're unsure about which number it was, you wouldn't go down one number, you'd have to go down 2 numbers, right? Because you're going, each one is a time. So you couldn't think, well, is this number 5? And then say, well, no, it's number 4, because then your number would be completely messed up. You'd have to go down to 3, unfortunately. So yeah, that's how you count them. So some people think that Safa to Marwa and then Marwa to Safa is one time, so they end up doing it 14 times. But it's actually one each. Okay, and you have to make sure that you go from Safa to Marwa so that you actually cover the entire distance from the between the two. Okay, and not the last thing, but one of the things that we mentioned is that a sa'i has to come after a valid tawaf. So if you're performing Umrah, just Umrah, then your sa'i would come after your tawaf that's for Umrah. If you're doing Hajj, then your sa'i can come, the sa'i for Hajj can come after the tawaf that's for Hajj, or it can come after the tawaf that's just the tawaf al-qudum. Okay, so in that case, your sa'i could technically come before the tawaf for your Hajj. Okay, and it can even come before Arafah. Okay. So it could be the sa'i for your Hajj could be the first rukn that you actually perform in that scenario. Okay, but it has to come after a valid tawaf. Okay, Ibn Hajar's opinion is that doing the sa'i after tawaf al-ifada, the Hajj tawaf, is better. Imam al-Ramli thinks that doing it after tawaf al-qudum is better. But either way is completely valid. Okay, and you have to start with Safa, and you have to end with Marwa. So if you start with Marwa and go to Safa, that doesn't count. It wouldn't count. You'd start counting from Safa to Marwa. Okay, because the Prophet ﷺ said that I start with what God has started, because the Quran says, "Inna Safa wal Marwata min sha'airillah." So Safa and Marwa are part of the rights are God's rights. So because the Quran put Safa before Marwa, the Prophet ﷺ started from Safa, and he said, I start with what God has started. Abda'u bima bada Allahu bi. So it's obligatory to start with Safa and end with Marwa. Okay, and the important thing is just covering the distance. That's the obligatory aspect, and we'll talk about some of the sunan related to sa'i in our next lesson. So on that note, that's the last rukn, or that we'll talk about, or rather those are the obligatory aspects that we'll talk about when it comes to sa'i. So this is half of our lesson on Hajj. In our next lesson, we'll talk about obligatory aspects of Hajj, and we'll end the chapter on Hajj on that note. So we'll finish our lesson for today on that note. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.